What if the biggest mistake of your life was actually the best thing that ever happened to you? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? The silence in the room was deafening. Cold sweat dripped down the back of Alexandra's neck as dozens of eyes watched her expectantly. In front of her, a long conference table gleamed in the intense light of the crystal chandelier. Park Group shareholders awaited his response. The chairman of the board, a man with gray hair and an imposing expression, had just stood up and announced with unshakable conviction, Alexandra Park is the new CEO of Park Group. His brain stopped working. Her heart skipped a beat so violently that she wondered if she was having a heart attack. New CEO? She? What was happening? She tried to laugh, a nervous laugh that died before it even reached her lips. He opened his mouth to speak, to correct that absurd mistake, but the words refused to come out. His gaze wandered around the room, settling on the huge screen that displayed his name in golden letters. Alexandra Park, CEO of Park Group. It could only be a dream. Or a nightmare. At the other end of the room, a man leaned back in the leather chair, watching the scene with an indecipherable smile. Alex Park. The company's rightful heir, the name that should be on that screen. He didn't seem shocked. On the contrary, there was something amusing in the sparkle in his eyes, as if he was reveling in the chaos that had just ensued. It was at that moment that Alexandra realized two things. First, that bastard knew exactly what was going on and wouldn't move a finger to correct it. Second, if she tried to explain herself right then, she ran the risk of appearing completely insane or, worse, incompetent. Breathe. Think. Don't freak out. She felt Suga's imaginary consciousness, which had been living in her mind for years, manifest itself with a tired sigh. Congratulations, CEO Park. Are you going to stand there looking like a fish out of water, or are you going to pretend you know what you're doing? She blinked a few times. The air around him felt thin. How did it get there? 2 hours earlier, Alexandra's morning had started like any other, running. She hurried through the entrance of the luxurious Park Group building, holding a cup of coffee and her bag balanced on her shoulder, while trying to confirm the interview time for the administrative manager position on her cell phone. It was the third selection process she had gone through within the company and, if she were rejected again, she might have to finally accept that her professional future was doomed to mediocrity. The elevator was packed when she entered, squeezing between executives exuding expensive perfume and corporate arrogance. He felt an elbow hit his ribs and held back an exasperated sigh. Another normal day in the hell of the corporate world. The voice in his head spoke again. Relax, CEO Park. You've survived worse things. Like that lunch with the boss where he mistook you for his secretary for the third time. Alexandra rolled her eyes. His sarcastic mind didn't help. When she finally arrived at the executive floor reception, an elegant and impeccable assistant looked at her with a professional smile. Name? Alexandra adjusted her bag on her shoulder and replied. Alexandra Park, for the administrative management interview. The woman nodded, made a note and indicated a hallway. This way, Mrs. Park. She followed the assistant, trying to control her nervousness. Little did he know that he was heading straight towards the biggest mess of his life. Back in the meeting room, the board president cleared his throat, bringing Alexandra back to the present. We look forward to your speech, CEO Park. She felt panic rising in her throat. Speech? What do you mean speech? She had never given a speech in her life, much less to a group of corporate sharks expecting her to demonstrate leadership and strategic vision. What to do? If he ran out of the room, maybe he could escape before anyone noticed their mistake. If he told the truth right then and there, the humiliation would be instant and irreversible. Alexandra felt a piercing gaze upon her. Alex Park was still there, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her with an almost amused interest. He wanted to see how far she would go. Damn. She swallowed hard, straightened her posture and did the only thing that could save her at that moment. He smiled confidently and began to speak. The coffee in Alexandra's hand was already lukewarm when she entered the imposing lobby of the Park Group building, a glass and steel skyscraper that reflected Seoul's vibrant landscape. The heels of her shoes echoed across the polished marble floor as she hurriedly walked to reception, adjusting her bag over her shoulder and trying to ignore the nervousness that churned in her stomach. That job interview wasn't just another attempt at professional advancement, it was her last chance to prove to herself that years of effort and dedication would finally pay off. She stopped in front of the counter where an impeccably dressed receptionist was typing something into the computer, without even looking up. Alexandra cleared her throat and said her name, explaining that she was there for the administrative manager interview. The receptionist nodded, sliding her eyes across the screen, and indicated that she should wait for a moment. Alexandra nodded, checking the time on her phone again. I was on time, but not late. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension, when he noticed something strange in the receptionist's behavior. The woman frowned slightly as she read something on the monitor, then looked up with a suddenly thoughtful expression. She asked her to wait just a moment and quickly typed on an internal phone before saying that someone would come and pick her up. Alexandra raised her eyebrows, surprised by the sudden change in treatment, but didn't have time to question it. Within seconds, a young man in a dark suit and impeccable posture emerged from one of the side corridors, offering a respectful smile before bowing slightly and inviting her to follow him. Alexandra's uneasiness grew with each step as she was led through sophisticated hallways, lined with minimalist artwork and lights strategically placed to create a modern and elegant environment. Something felt wrong, but she forced herself to ignore the feeling. Maybe they were just taking her to a more private waiting room. It was a big company, after all. When the dark glass doors of the conference room opened before her, any trace of tranquility completely dissolved. The room was vast and imposing, dominated by a long conference table and surrounded by men in well-tailored suits, who stopped their conversations as soon as she entered. The silence was instantaneous, and all eyes turned to her with an almost exaggerated reverence. Alexandra blinked, stunned, as an older, authoritative-looking man stood up from the head of the table and gave her a satisfied smile. He said that the new CEO of Park Group was finally there. Alexandra's mind froze. The new what? Panic rose in her throat, and she opened her mouth to correct the nonsense she had just heard, but the man continued speaking, praising her punctuality and expressing the council's confidence in her leadership. Alexandra tried to intervene, raising her hands in a hesitant gesture, but was cut off by the sound of polite applause around her. Her brain screamed for her to say something, anything, but her body felt paralyzed. Reality was unfolding before her like a crazy scene from a corporate drama, and she couldn't follow the script. That was when the door to the room opened again, and an electrifying presence filled the room. Alex Park entered with lazy steps and an indifferent expression, as if he had just woken up from a particularly comfortable nap. His perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable suit contrasted with the carefree aura he exuded. His eyes swept around the room until they landed on her, and something in his expression changed. Alexandra waited for him to say something, to correct the mistake, but, to her utter horror, an amused smile curved his lips. He leaned back against the wall, crossed his arms and simply watched. She felt Suga's imaginary conscience sigh inside her head, saying that now she was in trouble. The council president cleared his throat, getting his attention back. She said that before starting the meeting, they would like to hear a few words from her. The world revolved around Alexandra. She wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to run away and pretend that none of this had happened. But in the corner of the room, Alex Park continued to watch, and she knew in that moment that he was just waiting to see how she would react. She swallowed hard, took a deep breath and, against every instinct of self-preservation, smiled. If it was a game he wanted, then she would play it. The meeting room was suffocating. The leather of the chair beneath Alexandra felt too hard, the light from the chandelier hanging above the table glowed aggressively, and the director's sharp gaze pierced her with the expectation of a speech she had no idea how to begin. Her heart pounded inside her chest like a mismatched drum, and her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, before the prolonged silence began to feel suspicious. On the other side of the room, Alex Park was still leaning against the wall, a mischievous half-smile playing on his lips, as if he were watching a particularly funny comedy. Alexandra cleared her throat, forcing herself to look in control. If she said this was all a mistake, she would be kicked out of the company and probably never get a job in the city again. If he kept pretending, at least for now, maybe he would have time to find a way out. She took a deep breath and thanked the directors for the warm welcome, saying that she was honored to take on such an important position and that she looked forward to working together for the company's promising future. His voice was surprisingly firm, and she was surprised to notice that some of the men at the table nodded in approval. The meeting continued without giving her room to breathe. He barely had time to assimilate what was happening before the directors began debating ongoing projects, million-dollar investments and numbers that seemed like an alien language to his ears. Alexandra tried to remain impassive, nodding every now and then as if she knew exactly what they were talking about, but her brain was in complete meltdown. She did not understand the graphics that were projected on the screen, nor the discussions about new expansion strategies. When one of the directors turned directly to her and asked what the new CEO's approach would be to digitizing the company's financial services, her stomach sank. She wet her lips quickly and resorted to the only strategy that came to mind, the tactic of responding without actually saying anything. She stated that digitalization was undoubtedly a crucial aspect for the group's growth and that she was eager to explore all possibilities before making an informed strategic decision. The director seemed pleased, but before she could breathe a sigh of relief, another voice sounded from the other side of the table, full of interest and challenge. Alex Park said he would love to hear more about these possibilities. He asked if she already had any specific vision about how the company could stand out in this sector or if she was still at the stage of collecting basic information. The way he tilted his head, watching her with a teasing gleam in his eyes, made it clear he wanted to see her stumble. Alexandra felt her blood boil. She held his gaze and replied that, like any responsible leader, she believed that making hasty decisions could compromise the company's solidity. Her initial focus, she said, would be to analyze market trends and identify competitive weaknesses, ensuring that Park Group not only follows digitalization, but becomes a benchmark in the sector. The answer made a few directors nod in approval, and Alex raised his eyebrow slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to be able to escape so easily. The meeting dragged on for hours, and Alexandra felt exhaustion weighing down on her shoulders as the topics became more technical. Every time she thought she had managed to go unnoticed, Alex opened her mouth to ask her an unexpected question. He asked about the company's merger policy, talent retention strategies, and new approach to international marketing. He was testing her, pushing her to the edge, waiting for the moment when she couldn't pretend she knew what she was doing. When the meeting finally came to an end, Alexandra left the room as if she had run a marathon. The long hallway on the executive floor seemed narrower than usual, and every step he took towards the elevator made his head pound with the weight of the confusion. She needed to think. I needed to find a way out of that situation before it was too late. But before she could even touch the elevator button, a low, slurred voice sounded from behind her. Alex said she looked tired and asked if her first meeting as CEO had been as difficult as she imagined. She turned around, finding herself once again faced with that irritatingly carefree smile. He stood there, casual and calm, as if he hadn't just spent the last few hours making his life a living hell. She crossed her arms, having no patience for further provocation. He said he knew very well what he was trying to do and that if he wanted to regain his position as CEO, all he had to do was open his mouth and tell the truth. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the idea, and then smiled in an even more devilish way. He said that, in truth, he was not in that much of a hurry to resume his position. It was more interesting to watch what she would do now that she was stuck in that role. He added that he wanted to see how far she could take the charade before everything fell apart. Alexandra felt anger bubble in her throat. She asked him if he really thought it was funny to see her struggling in a role she hadn't been prepared for. He laughed softly and said he found it fascinating. She took a deep breath, trying to control herself. She asked him what he wanted, and Alex just smiled even more, saying he would make a deal with her. As long as he was having fun, he wouldn't reveal anything. But, in exchange, she would have to bear all the responsibilities of the position. No running away, no escaping. If he wanted to pretend to be a CEO, he would have to act like a real one. Her gaze narrowed. This was a game for him. A game where he could pull the strings and watch her dance on the edge of disaster. But Alexandra had never shied away from a challenge before, and she wasn't going to start now. He lifted his chin and said he accepted. The first thing Alexandra discovered upon taking on the role of CEO of Park Group was that her life had turned into a circus, and she was the main attraction. There was not a minute of peace. From the moment she stepped into the luxurious office at the top of the skyscraper, she was bombarded by meetings, contracts, urgent decisions, and an endless stream of emails marked top priority that made no sense to her. The phone on his desk wouldn't stop ringing, his personal assistant was pouring out an avalanche of information that his brain couldn't process, and Alex Park? He simply watched from the sidelines, occasionally making sarcastic comments and, when he felt like it, throwing her directly into the line of fire to see how she would fare. At the first operational meeting, Alexandra realized that she was in serious trouble. A group of senior directors stared at her expectantly as she blankly flipped through a presentation on financial forecasts and market projections. The company's CFO asked what its strategy would be for cutting costs in the next quarter. She tried to stall for time, saying that she needed more in-depth analysis before making a decision, but before she could continue the nonsense, Alex Park casually leaned forward in her chair and said that he was curious to know what specific guidelines she considered essential in this process. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was an ambush. Suga's imaginary consciousness sighed inside her mind and said that she was fried. She gritted her teeth, trying to ignore the urge to curse Alex right then and there, and replied that, obviously, the priority was to maintain a balance between efficiency and innovation. The directors seemed satisfied with the vague answer, and Alexandra suppressed the urge to celebrate. But then Alex smiled and said he'd love to hear more about how she intended to apply this approach to international operations. The room fell silent. She held her breath. He was enjoying himself, clearly expecting her to stumble. Alexandra straightened her posture and maintained her composure, saying that she was in contact with the international team to ensure that all decisions were made based on concrete data and aligned with the needs of the global market. Alex raised his eyebrows, as if impressed by the evasive response, but said nothing more. She survived. Badly, but survived. The problem was that the rest of the company didn't give him that same chance to improvise so easily. The volume of documents she needed to sign was absurd, and she didn't understand half the technical terms. On the first day, he accidentally almost approved $1 million budget for a project that didn't exist. Luckily his assistant alerted him at the last second. On the second day, he realized that he would have to educate himself in some way if he wanted to survive in that position. So, between one meeting and another, he started turning to his most reliable learning method, YouTube. In the first few weeks, he spent hours watching videos about business management, corporate strategies, and even absurd tutorials like how to sound confident when you don't know what you're talking about. In his office, he kept tabs open with constant research on financial terms he pretended to understand in meetings. Sometimes, when she found herself alone at night trying to decipher impossible reports, Suga would appear in her mind with his arms crossed and a look of boredom, asking her if she really thought that 10-minute videos would be enough to turn her into a real CEO. She would throw an imaginary pillow at him and go back to watching the video. But his biggest problem was, without a doubt, Alex Park. He seemed determined to test her at every possible opportunity, as if he was patiently waiting for the moment when she would break down. On the third day, for example, he showed up unannounced at your office and said there was an important corporate event that night. She had just 3 seconds to breathe a sigh of relief before he added that she would have to give a speech to hundreds of investors. She opened her eyes wide and asked if he was joking. He smiled and said he had never been so serious. Panic took over her. What do you mean a speech? What do you mean investors? She tried to argue that she needed more time to prepare, but Alex just shrugged and said that real leaders didn't prepare, they just dealt with the situation. That night, dressed in an elegant black dress borrowed from her assistant and balancing a glass of champagne in her sweaty hands, Alexandra found herself in front of a brightly lit stage, with dozens of influential faces eagerly awaiting her words. Alex was off to the side, looking totally relaxed, and when the host of the event called her to come on stage, he leaned in slightly and whispered that this was the perfect moment to show the world how brilliant she was. She wanted to punch him. But instead, he took a deep breath, walked onto the stage and began to speak. The first words came out haltingly, and her mind went blank for a moment, but then she remembered every generic phrase she'd ever heard at corporate events and began reciting them with confidence. He spoke about innovation, about the company's commitment to the future, about how he believed in the power of visionary leadership. The audience applauded at the end, and even though Alex had an amused look on her face as if he knew exactly what she had done, he didn't say anything. The next morning, when he arrived at the office, he found a newspaper clipping about the event on his desk, highlighting his presence and his speech. A scribbled note on the side read, "Not bad for a YouTube CEO." She crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. The following weeks were organized chaos. Alexandra still felt like a fake holding a position that wasn't hers, but somehow, against all odds, she was surviving. The most surprising thing was that, even when everything seemed to fall apart, she always found a way to stay standing. It didn't matter if she had to improvise in meetings, answer difficult questions without being sure of what she was saying, or even smile at investors who treated her like an unknown quantity. At the end of the day, no one seemed to realize that she had no idea what she was doing. And the worst? She was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was getting good at this. What made her most angry was the realization that Alex Park had also noticed this. He still challenged her, still pushed her into uncomfortable situations just to see how far she could go, but something had changed in the way he watched her. Before, his eyes only carried amusement, as if he was just waiting for her to trip and fall. Now, there was something more there. Curiosity. Maybe even respect. The realization came unexpectedly during an important business dinner. Alexandra knew that this Japanese client was one of the company's priorities and that a successful negotiation could mean millions in new contracts. The problem? The client had a reputation for being rigid and extremely difficult to convince. During the first minutes of the meeting, everything seemed to be heading towards disaster. The Japanese executive remained impassive, rejecting each proposal that the Park Group team presented. Alexandra could feel the tension in the air, the uneasy looks from the directors at the table, and, of course, Alex's presence, watching everything as if waiting to see what she would do. She took a deep breath and decided she had nothing to lose. Instead of following the formal, technical script that others were using, it completely changed the approach. She talked about the company's culture, about how Park Group didn't just want to close contracts, but build long-term partnerships. He shared a personal story, mentioning how he grew up in a family that valued trust above all else and how he believed that big business was not just about numbers, but about genuine relationships. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, but then the Japanese executive smiled slightly, something no one at the table expected to see. He said he respected that view and was therefore willing to reconsider the terms of the contract. The tension at the table dissolved. Alexandra felt relief course through her body as the directors began to relax and the negotiation finally took a positive path. But what really surprised her was Alex's expression. He observed her in a different way, as if he were seeing something new in her. That night, while everyone was discreetly celebrating the success of the negotiation, Alex approached her with an enigmatic smile. He said she had done a great job and that for someone who pretended to be a CEO, she sometimes seemed like a real one. She rolled her eyes and asked if that was a compliment or more of a tease, but he just laughed and walked away, leaving her with a strange warmth in her chest. Days later, the business trip came. Alexandra knew that sooner or later she would have to deal with international commitments, but she didn't expect her first test to happen in such a chaotic way. The plan was simple: she and Alex would travel together to Hong Kong for a series of meetings with foreign investors. But, as seemed to be the fate of his life lately, nothing went as planned. An error in the hotel reservation left them with no available rooms, and the only solution the reception could offer was a single room with 2 beds. Alexandra stared at the receptionist as if she had just suggested they sleep on the street. Alex, on the other hand, seemed to have more and more fun with the situation. He said he didn't see any problem and that if she was so uncomfortable, she could sleep on the couch. She crossed her arms and said that if anyone was going to go on the couch, it would be him. He raised his eyebrows and replied that he thought it was fair to decide this in rock, paper, scissors. She lost. That night, as he tossed and turned in his uncomfortable hotel bed, he heard Alex's slow, controlled breathing on the other side of the room. He seemed completely relaxed, as if sleeping next to her wasn't something worth worrying about. Which was annoying, considering she was there, completely awake and aware of his presence just a few feet away. The dawn advanced, and when she finally decided to give in to sleep, his voice broke the silence. He asked if she still thought it was all a mistake. She frowned in the dark, not knowing exactly what he was talking about. He continued, saying that at first he thought it would be a matter of time before she gave up, until she admitted that she didn't belong in that position. But now, looking at everything she had done, he was beginning to wonder if, deep down, maybe this was where she was always meant to be. She fell silent, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She said that sometimes she asked herself that question too. There was a long moment without words, just the sound of the air conditioning and the city outside. Then, for the first time, Alexandra felt that maybe Alex Park wasn't just a spoiled heir waiting for his downfall. Perhaps, like her, he was trying to discover his own place in the world. The first time Alexandra walked into that office as CEO, she felt like she was taking up space that didn't belong to her. Now, months later, as he walked through the corridors of Park Group, he noticed something different. The looks that previously carried distrust had changed. Some employees greeted her with genuine respect, others smiled encouragingly, and even those who initially ignored her began seeking her out to discuss projects and ideas. She was no longer just an extra in this corporate game. Somehow, against all odds, she was starting to become the leader she pretended to be. The most surprising thing was that the results were starting to appear. Alexandra discovered that although she didn't have the technical experience of the company's veterans, she possessed something that many of them had lost over the years: a pragmatic, humane view of business. While the directors were just focused on the numbers, she started asking different questions. What did customers really want? How could the company innovate without losing its identity? What could be done to motivate employees to be more engaged? One of his first major initiatives was to revamp the company's internal culture. During her nightly research, which, yes, still included YouTube tutorials and business management articles, she noticed that companies with high talent retention invested heavily in well-being and professional development. Therefore, he proposed an internal mentoring program, where more experienced employees would help younger employees to grow within the company. At first, the idea was met with skepticism. HR thought it would be a waste of time, and some directors questioned whether it would bring any real return. But, to his surprise, the employees themselves embraced the project. In a few months, engagement grew, and the internal climate began to change. On another front, she realized that Park Group was investing little in the technology sector. During a meeting, he raised the possibility of expanding the company's digital operations and suggested strategic partnerships with innovative startups. The board of directors, made up mostly of older, conservative men, reacted with disbelief. One of them said that Park Group had always remained strong with its traditional methods and that there was no need for sudden changes. Alexandra held his gaze and responded that traditional methods were undoubtedly respectable, but that companies that refused to evolve were doomed to be left behind. Alex, sitting on the other side of the table, watched the exchange with interest. When the director continued to insist that innovation should not be a priority, Alex smiled slightly and said that he found it fascinating to see how some people still believed that tradition was synonymous with resistance to change. The director fell silent, visibly uncomfortable, and Alexandra realized that, at that moment, Alex had chosen to be on her side. But, if on the one hand he began to publicly support her, on the other, something seemed to bother him. She noticed how he became quieter in meetings, how his provocative comments began to lessen. Even his casual and relaxed demeanor seemed to have changed. One day, when she entered his office unannounced, she found him staring at a financial performance spreadsheet with a lost look in his eyes. He asked if something was wrong, and it took him a second longer than usual to respond. He said no, that he was just analyzing the numbers, but the hesitation in his voice said something else. It was only after a group of employees spontaneously praised her leadership at an internal event that Alexandra understood. The company began to see her as a real CEO. And Alex was starting to realize that too. He asked her to dinner that night, something that had seemed natural before but now carried a different weight. The restaurant was sophisticated, and the table he reserved was in a more private corner, away from prying eyes. During dinner, he watched her for long moments without saying anything, as if he were studying her every move. When she finally asked what was going on, he smiled in a way that wasn't his typical teasing smile. He said she was doing well. Better than he expected. Better than anyone expected. She raised her eyebrows, surprised by his sincerity. He was grateful for the recognition, but he couldn't help but notice that there was something more behind that statement. He asked if that bothered him. He hesitated for a moment, then chuckled softly before admitting that maybe so. She said that, in the beginning, she thought this would all be temporary, that one time or another she would make a mistake and the council would demand her return. But now, seeing how accepting the company was of him, he began to wonder if he still had a place there. She didn't know what to say right away. Alex had always seemed confident, unshakable, but here, in front of her, for the first time, he seemed lost. He took a deep breath before responding that leadership was not a question of who was born for it, but of who was willing to fight to be good at what they do. He said that if he really wanted to be CEO, he needed to decide for himself whether he was ready for it, rather than waiting for the job to simply come back to him. He didn't respond right away, just watched her in silence. And then, finally, he smiled in a different way. Not with fun, but with something deeper. That night, Alexandra realized she wasn't the only person trying to find her way. The office has never felt so cold. The soft leather of Alexandra's chair already molded to her body, the corners of the table had marks from where she rested her hands while reviewing documents, and the panoramic view of Seoul, which had previously left her intimidated, was now just another detail in her day. That space, which was once a prison, became a home. But in that moment, everything felt unstable, as if every piece of what she had built was about to crumble. She knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the board meeting room. The air was charged, the shareholders were more attentive than usual, and in the center of the table, Alex Park stood with a posture she knew all too well. Trusting. Determined. About to do something that would change everything. He said that after months of reflection, he was finally ready to resume his role as CEO. He said that while he respected Alexandra's efforts, he believed it was time to reclaim his rightful place in the company founded by his family. Shock passed through the room in absolute silence, but nothing compared to what Alexandra felt at that moment. His body went motionless, as if someone had ripped the ground from beneath his feet. His words reverberated in your mind, but it took a while for them to make sense. He was taking the job back. Without warning her. Without even talking to her first. She held her breath and forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She knew that every person in that room was watching her reaction, waiting to see if the woman who had become CEO by accident would finally demonstrate that she didn't belong there. In a carefully controlled tone, she asked if that meant the decision had already been made. Alex stared at her for a moment before saying yes. He added that shareholders trusted that he was the right leader for the company and that despite what she had done, it was inevitable that he would return. She felt a bitter taste in her mouth. The meeting continued amid bureaucratic discussions about the transition, but Alexandra heard nothing more. The only thing he could process was the growing emptiness inside him. When the meeting ended, he stood up slowly and left the room without looking at Alex, ignoring the curious looks of the executives and the voice of his imaginary conscience, Suga, which manifested itself inside his mind saying that this had been a dirty trick even by Alex Park's standards. His office was at the end of the hall, and she entered without knocking. Alex was by the window, hands in his suit pocket, watching the horizon as if nothing had happened. When he noticed your presence, he slowly turned around, eyes assessing your expression. He said he knew she would come. She crossed her arms, feeling anger boil under her skin. He asked since when he was planning this and why he didn't tell him anything before. He sighed before saying that he always knew this moment would come. He said that, at first, it was fun to watch how she handled the role, but that he never really believed she would stay. He added that despite everything she did, he always waited for the moment when she would make a mistake big enough to warrant her return. The pain came like a punch to the stomach. She laughed, a short, incredulous sound, as if her body was trying to process what she had just heard. He said that then he never trusted her. He never thought she could actually be good at what she did. Alex hesitated for a second, and she saw a flicker of something that looked like regret in his eyes, but then he looked away and said it wasn't a matter of trust. He said it was always temporary, a game that had gone too far. She felt something break inside her. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words. He said that if that was how he saw it all, then there was no reason to stay there. He said he would resign from his position immediately and that he could have back what he always wanted. Alex stepped forward, saying it didn't have to be this way. He said she could continue with the company, that there was still room for her there. But she just smiled, an empty smile, and replied that there was never room for her. When he left the room, he didn't look back. Alexandra's absence was felt even before her departure was officially announced. The office, once pulsing with his presence, seemed quieter, colder, more predictable. Alex assumed the role of CEO with the ease everyone expected, resuming his natural position as heir to Park Group, but nothing seemed right. The dynamism that Alexandra had brought to the company was gone, replaced by a rigid routine that somehow seemed less efficient. At first, he tried to ignore this feeling, convincing himself that this was the natural course of things. But as the days passed, something unsettling began to grow within him. He found himself reviewing documents that had been changed by Alexandra, analyzing the notes she left in the margins, full of bold ideas and suggestions that no one else would have the courage to propose. He realized that many of the changes he considered insignificant at first were actually making a difference. The mentoring program she implemented drastically reduced employee turnover. Her approach to startups opened new fronts of innovation, and even team morale seemed to have been impacted by her leadership. But the worst part wasn't the professional impact. It was the fact that every time he entered the meeting room, he unconsciously looked for her. Every time someone mentioned a new proposal, he wondered what Alexandra would say. And every time he arrived at his office, the silence he once enjoyed began to feel oppressive. Meanwhile, Alexandra tried to move on. After his departure from Park Group, offers started coming in almost immediately. Competing companies wanted to hire her, some willing to offer senior positions, generous salaries, and promises of freedom to lead their way. Yet every time she sat down to consider the proposals, something inside her hesitated. It wasn't fear of change, nor insecurity about his abilities. It was the painful realization that, despite all the difficulties, she actually enjoyed leading. I liked the challenge, the dynamism, the responsibility. I liked feeling like I was making a difference. She found herself thinking about the employees at Park Group, the way they had begun to see her not just as an outsider but as a legitimate leader. She thought about how she liked facing the strictest directors and proving herself right. She thought about how her routine was full of unexpected events, and how, despite the chaos, she felt alive. But most of all, he thought about Alex Park. She tried to push away the memory of him, convincing herself that the feeling that lingered inside her was just hurt for what he did. But the truth was more complicated than that. He was irritating, arrogant and, in the end, disappointed her in ways she never imagined, but he was also the first person to see her potential, even if in the wrong way. He was the one who challenged her, who forced her to grow, who made her realize that she could be more than just an administrative assistant waiting for a promotion that would never come. The problem was that now she didn't know if she could forgive him. Back at Park Group, Alex spent more time than he would have liked trying to ignore the growing feeling that he had made a mistake. He thought that resuming his position would bring the satisfaction he had always hoped for, but all he felt was an emptiness he couldn't name. He tried to move on, immersing himself in work, but the meetings seemed longer, the events more tedious, the days more monotonous. The worst moment came when he found an old document in his office drawer. It was a contract that Alexandra had left unfinished, with notes scribbled in blue marker next to the clauses, suggesting changes that, he realized, made much more sense than the original version. He held the paper for a long time, his fingers skimming the margins filled with her handwriting, and then he let out a heavy sigh. It was at that moment that the truth finally hit him. He missed her. Not just as a professional, not just as the unexpected CEO who transformed the company. I missed Alexandra Park. And, worse than that, he realized that, at some point, without him even realizing it, he had fallen in love with her. The pen rested between Alexandra's fingers, motionless, as her eyes scanned the contract in front of her. The document, printed on thick, expensive paper, represented everything she should have wanted at that moment. A fresh start, a prestigious position, a salary that would make anyone sign without hesitation. The rival company's meeting room had a modern and impeccable look, with panoramic windows that let the golden light of the late afternoon illuminate the glass table. The CEO sitting on the other side of the table was smiling confidently, as if he already knew what her answer would be. She should sign. I had spent weeks evaluating proposals, analyzing opportunities, and here was the perfect chance to move forward. But for some reason, everything felt wrong. Her fingers gripped the pen tighter than necessary, and her mind, traitorous as ever, took her back to the halls of Park Group, to the chaotic meetings, to the challenges that made her feel alive. For Alex. Her heart lurched uncomfortably in her chest, and she hated every second of it. He shouldn't be in your thoughts anymore. He betrayed her, took something from her that she didn't even know she wanted until she was ripped from her position. But despite everything, she still remembered the way he looked at her before everything fell apart, the moment of hesitation in his voice when he said he always expected her to fail. There was a shadow of regret there. Or maybe it was just your imagination trying to give meaning to the unfixable. The CEO of the new company cleared his throat, bringing her back to the present. He said he understood it was an important decision, but he was sure it was the right place for her. Alexandra forced a smile, trying to ignore the weight in her chest, and said she just needed one more moment to reflect before signing. But before he could even consider picking up the pen again, the meeting room door unceremoniously opened. Alex Park walked in like he belonged there. The room froze. The executives present exchanged confused looks, and the CEO frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. Alexandra, on the other hand, felt her stomach drop. He was there. In front of her. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. He looked at her, his eyes carrying something she couldn't define, and then, without looking away, he said he needed to talk to her. Now. The CEO of the new company grumbled, asking if this was some kind of joke. He said that Alexandra was in the middle of an important decision and that she didn't have time for unnecessary interruptions. Alex didn't even look at him. He said if there was anyone who could talk about important decisions, it was him. Because you spent weeks trying to deal with the worst decision you ever made. Alexandra's eyes narrowed. He said that if he was there to try to convince her to return to Park Group, he was wasting his time. He said he himself made it clear that there was no room for her there. He stepped forward, his expression serious, and said he was wrong. The words hung in the air like electricity about to explode. Alexandra blinked, surprised by the frankness, and the executives in the room began to shift uncomfortably. The rival CEO crossed his arms, visibly irritated, and said that if Alex had something to say, he should say it quickly, because they were in a serious negotiation. Alex completely ignored it. He kept his gaze fixed on Alexandra and said he didn't want to run Park Group without her. He said he tried, that he thought he would return to his position as if nothing had changed, but everything was different. He said that every decision he made seemed wrong because he lacked someone to challenge him, to question him, to make him see beyond the obvious. He said that she was the only person capable of keeping the company alive, and that if she didn't come back, nothing at Park Group would ever work the same way. She crossed her arms, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. He said he no longer trusted him. He said he couldn't just forget what happened and go back as if nothing had happened. He nodded, as if expecting that answer, and then pulled a tablet from inside his jacket, sliding his fingers across the screen before turning it toward her. Alexandra's eyes widened when she saw the documents displayed. It was everything she had suggested over the last few months. Every change, every innovation, every initiative that shareholders had hesitated to accept. He implemented them all. The mentoring program was expanded to other sectors, the partnership with startups was generating new projects, and even the organizational structure had been reformulated to allow for more inclusion of internal talents. She looked up at him, confused. He asked why he did all this. He took a deep breath before answering that. At first, it was out of pride. Because he wanted to prove to himself that he still knew how to run the company without her. But after a while, he realized it wasn't just about business. He said that, no matter how hard he tried, he could no longer imagine Park Group without her. He said he didn't want her to come back as his employee, but as his equal. Co-CEO. The CEO of the new company snorted, saying this was nonsense. He said that Alexandra had a real opportunity here, a new beginning, and that she should think rationally. She still had no words. Everything about her screamed that accepting would mean getting hurt again, but there was something in Alex's eyes that felt different. He said he knew she no longer trusted him. Said he wouldn't trust her either. But he said he was willing to spend as much time as necessary proving he wouldn't make the same mistake again. Alexandra closed her eyes for a second, letting his words echo in her mind. Then, without saying anything, he picked up the pen he was about to use and slid the contract to the side. The CEO of the new company's eyes widened, but before she could protest, she stood up, picked up her bag and walked over to Alex, standing in front of him for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he said that he thought he had already made his decision. The city of Seoul sparkled under the night lights, reflecting off the towering skyscrapers like an ocean of inverted stars. The private restaurant at the top of one of the city's most luxurious buildings offered a panoramic view of the metropolis, but Alexandra wasn't paying attention to the landscape. She was sitting at the impeccably set table, watching Alex with a suspicious gaze as he poured wine into her glass with a deliberately casual expression. Experience had taught that when Alex Park acted too calmly, something was about to happen. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. He said he hoped this dinner wasn't an excuse to make her sign another stack of contracts before dessert. He smiled, resting his elbow on the table, and said he was offended by the insinuation that he was someone who would mix business and romance. After a moment, he added that, technically, yes, there was a contract for her to sign, but this one was a little different. She raised her eyebrow, already anticipating some kind of blow. He said that if he was planning to transfer more shares into her name without telling her, he should rethink the strategy, because this time she would read all the clauses before signing. He just chuckled softly and slid a white envelope across the table towards you. Alexandra hesitantly took the envelope, her fingers skimming the paper as she opened it. Inside, he found a single document. Irrevocable merger proposal between Alex Park and Alexandra Park. His heart stopped for a moment. I scanned the lines of the document, recognizing the formal structure of a contract, but instead of financial terms and business agreements, the text described something completely different. The first paragraph stated that both parties recognized that working together resulted in significantly increased productivity, motivation, and, most recently, unconditional love. The second clause stipulated that this merger would have no expiration date and would be automatically renewed on each anniversary. At the end of the document, a space awaited her signature. And, next to it, rested an engagement ring. She felt the air escape her lungs, and Alex's hand found hers on the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt both casual and decisive. He said he knew she liked to read contracts in detail before signing anything, but he hoped this would be one of the few cases where she would make an exception. She looked up at him, absorbing the expectation in his gaze, the small smile of someone who already anticipated that she would make a drama before responding. He said he needed time to consider. He said that decisions of this size required in-depth analysis, weighing risks and benefits before any definitive signature. He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes with feigned patience before replying that he agreed to wait. But only until the end of dinner. She held back the smile that threatened to form and picked up the pen strategically placed next to the contract. He said he would only sign if there was a clause guaranteeing he couldn't irritate her in the office. He chuckled, taking the pen from your hand and twirling it between his fingers before handing it back. He said that this clause was impossible to fulfill, but that he could guarantee that he would only irritate her with love. She rolled her eyes, but her heart had already made its decision before her mind could even question it. With a resigned sigh, he slid the tip of his pen across the paper, signing his name just below his. Alex smiled and took the ring, slipping it onto her finger with the ease of someone who knew, from the beginning, that this was the only contract that really mattered. He held her face in his hands, watching her for a brief moment before saying that from that day forward, CEO Park would never have to manage anything alone again. She smiled before pulling him into a kiss. Outside, the city continued to shine. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.